What was the most intense experience of your life? Meningitis. Pain so intense you have a moment of panic just before each heartbeat because you know how bad your head will hurt during it. Only time I've experienced fever hallucinations. Eyes open I was in the hospital. Eyes closed I was somewhere else. Other times eyes closed I could still see the hospital room but there was a girl with short hair sitting in a chair watching me. They didn't want to give me a Foley bag for whatever reason so every time I went to the bathroom, which was a lot with the IV, I would spend the next 5 minutes dry heaving into a cardboard bowl, which in turn did wonders for the headache. When I could finally eat again after 6 days at hospital, turkey sandwich was the most delicious thing. Nurses later told my wife they didn't think I was going to make it through first night. Good times. On Saturday I was rafting in grade 5 rapids in New Zealand. We flipped and I got thrown into a recirculation hole. I was being forced underwater with the power of a river with nowhere to get out. I tumbled around like a washing machine for about 30 seconds. Seemed like a lifetime. Eventually and luckily a thrust of water popped me out of the hole and into the next rapid. I got into calmer water with everyone already safe on the bank watching on in terror hoping I was alright. My paddle snapped. I swallowed some water, but overall I lived. Going rafting in New Zealand in 2 days. Super glad I stumbled across this. LOL. So I'm a type 1 diabetic. About 6 months ago, I forgot to test my blood sugar levels before going to bed. I woke up 6 hours later, keenly aware something was wrong, but I wasn't quite sure what was wrong. I jumped out of bed and stumbled, literally stumbling, to the kitchen, and desperately tried to eat something. By the time I had reached the kitchen, my blood sugar was so low that my consciousness began to recede, and I could feel it fading. I remember trying to make French fries because the pantry was empty, but in my barely conscious state I put them in the toaster instead of the oven. My last memory before I lost consciousness is being frustrated upon remembering fries do not go in the toaster, and trying to pull them out. Thank God it was unplugged. Luckily I still lived with my parents, who woke up while I was unconscious and found me trying to get ice cream to eat, but being unable to get it or form a sentence. Thankfully, they got my blood sugar up and sat me down on the couch and regained consciousness. I still remember the loss of control though, and it is intensely terrifying, even as a memory. Called to a reported house fire. Neighbor states they hear screaming and saw smoke flames. This is farm country at 3 AM. Captain and I hop barbed wire fences as we frantically race to this farmhouse to see what happened. Yep, goats. The farmer simply approached us and said, "Howdy boys." Problem: when asked about the screaming and fire, he said he had a brush pile burning and that my goats needed a milking. Learned how closely goats and people sounded the same. Captain shook his head as we talked back to the engine and said to never mention this back at the station. Or maybe he was a serial killer who burned his victims alive and uses the goat farm as a front. Having a knife held to my throat by an incredibly drunk friend who got mad at me about a game of kill, marry, frick around a campfire. I was wasted and he was wasted, and obviously kind of insane, and for some reason my reaction was to yell, "What? You're gonna kill me? Do it. Do it. You won't do it. I freaking dare you," at the top of my lungs. At the time I thought it was fine and the rational way to get him to back down, but later my friends told me they thought there was at least a 50% chance this guy was gonna slit my throat. And a 10% chance he was going to marry you. Staring into the eyes of a stranger to whom I was giving CPR, resuscitation, and watching him die, I think a part of me went to, I hope I can grow that back by living a worthy life. 1992, April. He was 63. I was 25. It still hurts. We can only try to help those around us to the best of our abilities. As a side note, my dear old dad also had to do CPR many years before on a 9-year-old who drowned at a scout outing. She died too, so he was able to talk things through with me after my incident. My brother watched a man collapse and stop breathing after a heart attack jogging, raced over to him and did CPR and that man lived. So luckily not all stories end sadly, and I would still encourage those who don't know how to do CPR to learn. And I would still jump in to do the same thing if it ever happened again. Spending 3 days in palliative care with almost all my family watching my dad slowly die. We laughed and told stories all while he lay there sleeping. There was so much love and compassion in that room that when he finally did slip away, it was as sad that we were losing the chance to spend time together in that tiny cramped room. I'll never forget watching his body die, but I also won't ever forget sitting on the floor in the room eating sandwiches and stealing a little bit from a flask of vodka that someone had brought to put in my Coke just to take the edge off. Every night you would hear the cries from other rooms as another family said goodbye, only to be replaced by someone else the next day. A race to a finish line no one wanted to win. My dog was hit by a car 2 summers ago. He's my best friend and my whole world, and we were out for a walk one night when somebody ran a red light. Very narrowly missed me, but struck him. Scary part was I looked both ways down a one-way street and I saw the car moving a block away. The light turned in our favor. Next thing I look over and the car is barreling through the light towards us. She didn't stop. Tore my dog off his leash and out of his harness and throw him a solid 25+ feet away. In that split second I thought I just watched my best friend die in front of me. After he was done tumbling, he got up and in shock tried to run back home. We were around the block. He finally stopped a couple hundred feet from my apartment, and when I went to go grab him I could feel blood and water. He peed himself on impact, coming from him, but I didn't know where. Luckily I jumped back and in that action managed to flip his head away from the car, otherwise it would have hit him square in the head. His hindquarters took the brunt of the injuries and impact. The lady didn't stop, and she was never caught. Saddled me with all the vet bills and extended care, but what matters most is that my best friend is still alive and with me. That absolute B. I hope karma gets her back somehow. When I was a young kid I got spinal meningitis. It damaged my heart and brain in a way that destroyed most of my memory function. I get by pretty well now. I just have to write stuff down and it's annoying. Anyway, I ended up in the hospital for 8 or 9 months because of the stack of complications they were trying to figure out. About half of this time, that I remember, was in the ICU and half was in a room with 4 other kids in beds. Amazingly enough, that alone isn't the most intense part. The kid in the bed next to mine came in because he and his brother were fricking around being kids and his brother was clumsy and smacked him in the neck with a baseball bat and collapsed his trachea. He'd been there a week, wasn't talking much, obviously, but he developed a cough. So, as an aside, the day doctors and nurses were phenomenal cool people. The night staff was bad. I remember being 8 and thinking these people are mean, lazy and worthless. So it's night time and the kid starts coughing. He rings his bell to ask for water and the nurse comes in, obviously grumpy, with a pitcher and cup and just leaves it on his tray. Doesn't say a word. The kid tries to fill the cup and ends up coughing more and spilling the pitcher all over his bed. He rings the nurse again multiple times and she finally comes in several minutes later and takes everything. All of his bedding and the pitcher and cup. So the kid is laying there on a bare mattress coughing harder and cold. One of the other kids and I took the sheets from our beds and wrapped him up. He was crying and cold. Half an hour later the nurse was still gone and the kid's cough was worse and kinda rattly. At this point my memory gets foggy and I think I fell asleep, but I woke up to one of the other kids in his bed screaming. I look over and the kid is gasping and frantically pushing his call button. We all started screaming and doing the same thing while this kid is making the most god-awful gurgling sounds and starting to turn blue. Finally the nurse comes running in smelling overwhelmingly like cigarettes and screams. She goes running out of the room. A few seconds later the room is full of yelling medical staff. They pull his curtain around his bed and, after a few minutes, end up wheeling him out really slowly. Whoever was this nurse's immediate supervisor, we hear bluntly later on, yelling at her, "You ignored your station to go have a smoke and didn't get a replacement. You let a kid freaking die." Turns out his tracheal wall collapsed from the force of the coughing and we all sat there and listened to a 7-year-old kid suffocate on his own throat and die. So that was pretty freaking intense. She got fired. My mom told me, years later, that our doctor said she committed suicide. My friend was accidentally roofied when his friend gave him a drink another man had given him. That was his second and last drink of the night. I took him home shortly after. He became belligerent and unintelligible during the 10-minute cab ride. He was unable to walk to his door, or even stand. He was a mess, in and out of consciousness, crying, begging me to let him sleep. I called 911 because I was very concerned. Mid-phone call he begins to seize and foam at the mouth. I had to give him CPR twice. Ambulances finally came. I could not wrap my head around what had happened. I even asked the EMT, do I seem drunk to you? Because we drank the same amount and I feel pretty sober. They had to defibrillate him to stabilize his heart. On the way to the hospital, the doctor said he had Rohypnol in his system and that he probably would have died if I had let him sleep it off. The next morning, my friend said the last thing he remembered was dancing at the gay bar, drinking his drink. Almost lost my best friend. My second year of college, I was 20. I came home from class to find my roommate passed out on the floor with an empty bottle of prescription pills next to him. He had been depressed due to some serious family issues, but I never thought it would come to suicide. I had never dealt with anything like this and was 3,000 miles away from any of my family or friends, and his mom was 6,000 miles away. His dad lived nearby, but he was the cause of the depression, so I was panicked. I had no idea what to do in the situation. I tried to get him up and he started to stir a little bit, which was great, but he was completely non-functional. I called my dad, who immediately calmed me down and told me I needed to call 911. I thought I might be able to get him down to my car to drive him to the hospital. I was afraid the ambulance would cost too much money for his family. Luckily, my dad made me realize I was being irrational and I called the ambulance and then informed his mom, who made the situation so much worse. They pumped his stomach and he was released from the hospital a few days later. His dad came to be with him and took me home later in the evening. It was such an awful car ride. My friend attempted suicide 2 more times and each time I was the one who found him and called the ambulance. It was a really rough couple of months, which forced me to leave college and move back home to finish out school near my family. I'm happy to report my friend is fine now and doing really well in all aspects of life, but it was really scary for a while. I don't know how I managed to keep my head about me, for the most part. I puked a little inside my mouth because of the fact that people sometimes have to worry about money while worrying about someone who is in a serious medical situation. I've had some pretty intense experiences, but one comes to mind pretty quickly. I was about 19 years old, and me and my dad were caught in a giant riptide. I'm a strong swimmer, and I was confident in my father. It was us and about 20 other people, while there were only about 5 lifeguards. Everyone was being pulled out to sea pretty rapidly. Some were calm and others were freaking out. I looked to my left and saw a boy, about 9 years old maybe, who was freaking out and couldn't keep his composure. I swam towards him and started calming him down, saying, "Don't worry bud, it won't last forever. Just save your energy and don't fight it. The lifeguards will be here. Lay on your back and try to float." While he's crying, I swam to him and put my hands under his back, and he started floating. I maneuvered us horizontally and then a lifeguard came and took him away. I got to shore about 30 seconds later, and he was crying while his mom was yelling at him, telling him things like, "Why didn't you listen to me? You can't swim that far away." I went up to the mom and I was going to give him a high five and tell him that he did a great job of keeping calm. As I started talking, the mother looked at me, scolded at me and looked me head to toe, grabbed his hand and walked away. 2-year-old daughter was limping with a fever on a Sunday, so I took her to an urgent care clinic. In the first hour of getting there, she falls unconscious and her fever spikes to 103. They give her some pain meds. She wakes up and the urgent care clinic tells me she needs to be transported by ambulance to the children's hospital, but they won't transport her without an IV. At this point her heart rate had stayed over 180/194 an hour. They attempt to do an IV 3 times and each time that they are unsuccessful her heart rate skyrockets. My 2-year-old is beyond upset at this point. She has a fever, she's sick, and they'd been poking her. The staff goes in for a 4th attempt. This is what was the most intense moment of my life. My child is being held down and screaming for all she is worth. One nurse on her left side is trying for an IV. The other nurse on the right side is watching the heart monitor. The monitor reads 238 beats per minute. The nurse monitoring the heart rate tells the other nurse to stop or she'll die. Worst words to say in front of a parent. The other nurse replied, "If I don't get an IV and she'll die in transport." Even worse words. I was terrified my daughter was going to die. She ended up having an ear infection with nothing more wrong with her. Terrible experience and several $1,000 bill. She had ear infections almost every 6 weeks for all of 2016. We were normally really good at catching them. The limping just threw me off. She has tubes now. We have health insurance and we had met our deductible. The bill was for two different things. 1. An ambulance transport is a flat rate $1,000 fee, like a very large copay. 2. The urgent care clinic was in network but the doctor on staff that day was not. I didn't know that was possible. So his time and some of the things they did that day was considered out of network and thus insurance paid for none of it. Pediatric clinician here. Kids' heart rates can be way higher than us adults and still be fine. During periods of agitation I've seen kids be 190-220 for several hours many times. Their resting heart rates are a lot higher as well. If you saw an adult at 230 BPM they're almost definitely in some kind of abnormal heart rhythm. At a BBQ down by the river my 4-year-old nephew disappeared. There were about 10 adults around and none of us saw him go. We were in the middle of a large grass reserve. River on one side, a wetland bird sanctuary on the other and we all panicked. After about 15 minutes of searching with no luck, we called the cops, hoping they could help us find him. It took them half an hour to get there and by this time, we were all frantic, but none more so than my sister. She was wading through the water, screaming his name, over and over. His name is Will and I tell you, Stranger Things gave me flashbacks. I have never been so heartbroken in my life. I was just beginning to realize that he had probably drowned and I'd never see him again when we look up and see my husband walking across the grass, my nephew holding his hand. There was a playground that every one of us had searched twice, but he somehow found his way there. To this day, we have no idea how he snuck away, or where he was for those 45 minutes. We all got very drunk that night. Had a very similar experience. Cottage on an island. Missing 4-year-old, who loved dogs. Adults searching increasingly frantically. The kid's dad making another guy dive under the dock cause it was the only place that hadn't been searched and he didn't want to find his daughter there. She was found asleep under a chair pretending to be a dog. My emergency C-section. I felt so sick from the meds, and could do nothing but lay there and accept my fate. I could feel the pressure of being cut open and dug into. Then I felt major things being wiggled around and plop, it felt like one of those dead whales on the beach exploding. My baby was out of me and wailing. Then, he was plopped on my chest looking pee off. I actually had come in the day before leaking and they sent me home because the tests were negative. Well, my water really broke 24 hours later. I labored to a 6 cm before getting an epidural. My son's heart was decelerating in the womb every contraction I had, and there were smaller, abnormal ones on top of big ones. They did an amni infusion to see if it would help him a bit, but it was clear his cord was wrapped. Being cut open was interesting. The worst part was the way the drugs made me feel. When they plopped him on me and were sewing me up, I literally just wanted him off me. In the recovery room afterwards, I felt like I had to puke and the nurse told me to clench my stomach. Yeah, right. I was numb up to my armpits. Crashed my bicycle at around 40 miles per hour on pavement with nothing but lycra on. Broken wrist, collarbone and road rash like nobody's business. This was back in 2003. Qualifies as a TIFU I guess. I had volunteered for the MIS 150 bike tour as a mobile mechanic in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I was on the bike with a backpack full of tools and spare tubes providing mechanical support, sweeping or helping those who broke down or had a flat. It was an amazing fall day, 70s, so we are all in shorts and jerseys. Towards the end I was itching to ride just to ride, so I passed my tool pack to my buddy and went on to ride the last section as a regular rider. These hills were fast and I was ripping down them. Super slow up, but hey, I was out there. There was a really nice steep descent with a sharp left at the bottom. This is the scene. It was a nice hairpin corner, but to make things worse it was covered in gravel from a recent washout. Just out of sight from the entrance, there was a volunteer warning riders to slow down, so everyone got through safe. After the last riders passed the hazard area, the volunteer packed up shop and moments later I came ripping down the hill. I entered the corner and leaned in pretty well, looked ahead and there was the gravel. This is the oh crap situation, and I managed to slow down to about 40 miles per hour or so when the bike just vanished out from underneath me. I stuck my hands out and that's all I remember for a while. As soon as my hands hit the ground all my fingerprints were torn off. wrist folded in no way a wrist is ever supposed to fold, snap the collarbone in half, and slide 50 or so feet on the gravel into the ditch. I remember waking up in the ditch face down, taking my mangled arm and pushing myself over. Once I went to lay my arm back down, I heard the crunching of the collarbone ends and realized I should just lay there and not try to get up. Fortunately, as karma would have it, there was a couple more riders I had helped along the way who found me, and an ambulance ride later I was on my way to the ear. I hit the ground so hard the lenses came out of my Oakleys, but the frame was still on my head. My speedometer popped off the bike, so I have no recording of my top speed that day. As I slid into the ditch, my helmet erased off my head like an eraser, and by the time I stopped there was hair sticking out of the flat spot. They said if it weren't for my helmet I wouldn't have survived the slide into the ditch. T-plate with 6 screws permanently in my wrist and nerve damage which left my hand completely numb until a carpal tunnel release. Collarbone almost punctured my lung. I get stopped at airport security from time to time and just have to show the scar. They cringe and shuffle me through. This bike is the namesake bike in my username. A Trek with XT components that I love to ride. TL. DR. Wear your bike helmet and be careful. We only get one shot at this life. I was dog sitting for my brother. He has 2 giant dogs. It was a Saturday morning. My daughter was coloring at the table while I made pancakes. Suddenly, everything felt off. I heard a thump behind me, and even though it had been a solid few months without a seizure, I knew without even turning around that the thump was my daughter falling to the floor. I'm actually a very panicky person, so the fact that I got the giant dogs in their kennels and unplugged the pancake griddle before I even turned around is impressive. It wasn't her first seizure. I carefully moved her off the hardwood floor and onto a rug. I started a timer. Apparently short seizures are totally fine, but once you hit 8 minutes, that's when you should worry. I always worry from the first second. But hey, I'm no medical expert. I called 911 at minute 4. Since I'd yelled for my husband at minute 2, we were in the car and driving 90 miles per hour to our small town clinic at minute 5. She started moaning in my arms at minute 6. Otherworldly, heart-stopping moans. It took every last bit of anything even remotely resembling strength I had to not curl up and die of worry, stress, etc. I've never, ever felt that helpless and scared in my entire life. And then we finally finished the 25-mile drive to town and she came out of it. I thought we were through the worst of it as a nurse rushed us to the ER. And then my 3-year-old daughter started trying to talk to me. Could not understand a freaking word. I nodded and smiled and acted like I knew what she was saying because I didn't want her to be scared. She started wiggling in my arms and I knew she wanted to walk around and not be held. I lowered her to the ground and she just collapsed. Those little legs had been through a 25-minute seizure, but the way she looked at me when it happened, I still have no idea how I managed to meet her gaze and then scoop her up and comfort her when I felt such terror and worry course through me. The stuff of nightmares. The good news is she's fine, and we're about to hit the 2-year anniversary of being seizure free. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.